Chapter 5: Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the First Bureaucratic Failures. The earliest civilizations offer the first clear demonstration of the capability, complexity dynamic in action. Long before the classical empires rose, the river kingdoms of the ancient world constructed administrative systems astonishingly sophisticated for their time. These early states, most prominently the city-states of Mesopotamia and the dynastic civilization of Egypt, built machines of governance large enough to demand a reliable pool of competent operators. They produced the world's first taxation regimes, record-keeping systems, labor mobilization structures, agricultural planning offices, and state religious bureaucracies. They also produced the first cases of systemic collapse caused not by invasion or moral decay, but by a widening gap between system complexity and available human capability. Later generations mythologize these collapses, gods abandoning the land, cities punished for sin. But beneath the poetry lies a universal structural truth. Once the administrative load exceeded the cognitive and organizational capacity of society, the system failed. Mesopotamia's early states were built around irrigation agriculture. The rivers nourished the land but also flooded unpredictably, and managing these waters required canals, levees, gates, reservoirs, and seasonal labor rotations. This demanded mathematical planning, written records, and a working understanding of hydrology. The engineers, scribes, and overseers of Sumer and Akkad became the world's first professional administrators. Cities such as Uruk, Lagash, and Ur developed bureaucratic structures capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of workers and storing immense quantities of grain in temple complexes. We even possess direct documentary evidence of early institutional strain. A clay tablet from Ur, dated to around 1750 BC, records a merchant angrily complaining that a copper supplier delivered inferior material and mistreated his agents. This is not folklore. It is one of the oldest written customer complaints in human history. Its importance is structural. It shows that even at the dawn of bureaucracy, quality control was already weakening, enforcement was inconsistent, and trust between economic actors was eroding under expanding system complexity. Standards were slipping not because people became dishonest, but because institutions were becoming harder to regulate competently. This administrative success, however, created vulnerability. Irrigation systems are inherently complex and require constant maintenance. Sediment accumulates. Levees erode. Distribution networks become politically contested. The margin for error is extremely small. If the bureaucracy fails to coordinate labor, track supplies, and monitor field conditions, the agricultural base collapses. That is precisely what happened repeatedly in ancient Mesopotamia. City-states flourished as long as their scribal class maintained high capability density. When political upheaval, demographic stress, or prolonged conflict weakened that class, even slightly, the irrigation system outpaced administrative competence. Fields became saline or barren. Famine followed. Populations dispersed. Cities entered decline. One of the clearest demonstrations of this dynamic occurred during the collapse of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon's successors. The empire expanded rapidly as Sargon and his grandson Naram-Sin integrated vast territories into a centralized system. This expansion multiplied administrative burdens, tracking grain shipments, organizing labor levies, managing temple inventories, provisioning armies, and maintaining communication across distant provinces. When a multi-decade drought struck, the margin for bureaucratic error evaporated. Agricultural output shrank while administrative demands grew, and the empire lacked the depth of capable officials required to navigate the crisis. What might have been a harsh but survivable climatic event instead triggered a chain reaction failure of logistics, taxation, and military cohesion. Rebellions erupted. Outposts fell. Imperial authority dissolved. The drought was the spark. The structural vulnerability, the widening gap between system complexity and operator capability, determined the magnitude of the collapse. Egypt, by contrast, benefited from the predictability of the Nile's annual flood. This environmental stability enabled its bureaucracy to become remarkably sophisticated and long-lasting. The state mobilized labor for monumental architecture, maintained flood basins, and collected grain for redistribution. The scribal class was trained in a rigorous and hierarchical instructional system, producing an administrative elite capable of sustaining empire for centuries. Yet, Egyptian history reveals the same recurring pattern of capability erosion leading to collapse. The Old Kingdom, responsible for the construction of the pyramids, dissolved into the First Intermediate Period not solely because of low-Nile floods, but because the central bureaucracy could no longer coordinate powerful provincial nobles. As capability density declined, local officials exercised autonomy, records became inconsistent, and political authority fragmented. Egypt eventually rebuilt central power, but the pattern repeated in the Middle Kingdom and again after the New Kingdom. Each collapse aligned with periods in which the complexity of the state apparatus exceeded the training, discipline, and institutional cohesion of its bureaucratic class. Egypt even left us direct evidence of late-stage institutional decay. Around 1300 BC, Pharaoh Horemheb issued sweeping reform edicts threatening officials with mutilation and death for corruption, tax fraud, record falsification, and abuse of authority. Such decrees are not signs of strength. They appear only when internal discipline has already collapsed. Law multiplies when trust is gone. Coercion expands when competence disappears. Horemheb was not reforming a healthy state, he was desperately trying to stabilize a decaying one. The collapse of the New Kingdom after the reign of Ramses III provides the clearest evidence. The empire faced external invasions and economic disruption, but the deeper cause was administrative decay. The government became bloated. The temple economy consumed vast state resources. The Wilbur Papyrus, a detailed Egyptian land tax register from the 12th century BC, reveals the system's inner mechanics. It records classifications, exemptions, and administrative layers with obsessive precision. On the surface, it reflects bureaucratic sophistication. Beneath it lies distortion. Priestly estates receive exemptions. Tax burdens shift downward. Enforcement becomes selective. The bureaucracy survives, but its integrity does not. The system still functions, but no longer fairly, uniformly, or efficiently. Appearance replaces substance. Corruption increased as officials exploited their positions. Tomb workers went on strike, nearly unprecedented in Egyptian history, because they were not being paid. The state could no longer coordinate its own institutions. Administrative offices increasingly passed through hereditary lines that no longer maintained the competence of earlier generations. Training standards fell. Institutional discipline weakened. The bureaucratic culture that once upheld high performance eroded. Egypt did not collapse because its people lost intelligence. It collapsed because its system had grown too complex to be operated by a shrinking pool of capable administrators during a period of economic and military stress. These early civilizations reveal a fundamental principle: the more complex the system, the more catastrophic the consequences of capability erosion. In a tribal society, failure affects a small group. In a city-state, failure of the scribal class affects thousands. In an empire, failure of administrative capability affects millions and destabilizes entire regions. Complexity amplifies incompetence. Ancient societies had no buffer against this dynamic. They could not import skilled administrators at scale. They could not rapidly mass-educate literate workers. They could not simplify irrigation or redistribution systems without risking collapse. Once capability declined, failure became inevitable. A second insight emerges from the ancient record: capability decline often preceded visible institutional failure by decades. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, minor administrative errors accumulated long before systemic breakdown. Temples miscounted grain. Records were lost or falsified. Labor assignments became inconsistent. Corruption grew quietly. These micro-failures did not immediately destroy the state, but they weakened structural integrity until an external shock, drought, invasion, epidemic, or economic disruption, triggered collapse. The pattern is identical in later empires. Collapse is rarely a single event. It is the moment when long-running internal decay removes a civilization's ability to absorb stress. These ancient civilizations are particularly instructive because their administrative systems left behind unusually transparent records. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia show fluctuations in grain yields correlating with periods of bureaucratic breakdown. Egyptian inscriptions trace the waxing and waning of central authority as scribal competence thickened or thinned. Archaeological surveys show irrigation networks decaying during periods of administrative disorder. The sources reveal the same universal pattern: capability declines first, complexity remains constant, and the gap eventually becomes fatal. Mesopotamia and Egypt therefore provide the template for understanding the life cycle of empire. Their successes demonstrate how a concentration of capable individuals can build systems of extraordinary complexity. Their failures demonstrate how fragile such systems become when the supply of capable operators falls. These early civilizations lacked the demographic buffers, technological tools, and educational scalability of modern societies, yet the underlying dynamic is identical. Capability scarcity is not a modern problem. It is a permanent feature of human civilizations operating complex systems. As we move into the classical world, Greece, Persia, and Rome, we will see these dynamics operating on larger scales with greater visibility. The ancient world established the blueprint. The later empires merely repeated it with higher stakes and more dramatic consequences.